On Thursday, April 9, 1978, at the abandoned Redfield elevator outside Bellwether, Iowa, 29-year-old Alina Voss pressed a yellow paint marker to the first of 700 rust-streaked grain bins while auction crews waited for her check. Walter Kessler, the co-op manager, looked across the weeds and said, "You bought 700 roofs with nowhere to put them." Because Alina was not cataloging 700 buildings. She was cataloging 700 sets of curved, corrugated parts, each one already cut, rolled, punched, galvanized, braced, roofed, and tested by years of holding grain against wind and weather. The yellow marks told her where every piece belonged. If the pieces could be taken apart without losing that order, they could be moved without losing what made them useful. Nobody was paying attention to Alina then. Around Bellwether, she was the tall woman who tested grain moisture, repaired fan motors when a bearing began to complain, and walked the Voss farm with measured, heel-first steps, a cheap black spiral notebook tucked into the pocket of her faded green canvas work jacket. Her copper-auburn hair stayed in a practical shoulder-length braid. Thin, silver wire-rim glasses sat above a light scatter of freckles, and when she bent over the first galvanized wall sheet, the small crescent-shaped birthmark below her right ear appeared above her cream cotton collar. She kept calculations nobody had asked for, measured equipment nobody planned to move, and wrote down the condition of bins that lenders had already decided to destroy. That was about to change. Alina Voss was 29 years old in the spring of 1978. She lived and worked on 312 acres in Harrow County, where the Voss family raised corn, soybeans, hay, and enough cattle to make every winter feed bill worth studying twice. The land carried $68,400 in debt. The farm account held $18,420 in reserves, which sounded comfortable until machinery, fertilizer, seed, taxes, and one dry summer were allowed into the room. Alina had $46,180 in personal savings. She had accumulated it through grain testing, seasonal repair work, custom fan balancing, and years of living in 2 upstairs rooms of the Voss farmhouse rather than paying rent in Bellwether. She knew precisely what the money represented. It was 11 years of mornings, evenings, and checks folded into the back of her notebook before they ever reached a bank teller. The 11 abandoned elevator sites represented something else. Let me tell you about those sites, because you need to understand why the lender wanted the bins gone before you can understand why Alina wanted every one of them. Each elevator had failed for a slightly different reason. One had lost its rail siding. 2 had been built along roads that could no longer carry the truck traffic needed to support them. 4 had belonged to an operator who expanded on borrowed money and ran out of operating cash. The remaining sites had dwindled as farms consolidated and grain moved toward larger concrete terminals beside better highways. Failure had emptied the elevators, but it had not made the structures disappear. Standing galvanized bins still needed liability insurance. Weeds had to be cut around ladders, electrical cabinets, and rusting loadout pipes. Loose roof sheets had to be secured after storms. Trespassers had to be kept away from pits and catwalks. Every month the sites remained open. The lender paid for land that produced nothing and structures it could neither operate nor ignore. Demolition bids were worse. A contractor could crush the bins for scrap, but cranes, torches, trucks, and disposal fees would consume much of the metal value. Therefore, the lender offered the structures as situated, meaning the buyer received what stood on the concrete and accepted the expense of removing it. Conventional operators had already inspected them. They saw narrow bins with outdated fans, patched roof seams, old electrical controls, and capacities that looked small beside the larger tanks, then appearing at modern elevators. A new bin arrived in labeled bundles with factory drawings and unelongated bolt holes. These old bins stood across 11 sites, and each site required a crew, a crane, transportation, sorting, cleaning, and storage before reconstruction could begin. Buying larger modern bins looked easier because labor was expensive and disorder was more expensive still. Alina did not disagree with that calculation. She changed one assumption. The operators priced each old bin as a separate structure. Alina priced the 700 bins as an inventory of modular shells. She had learned enough from repairing them to know that the vertical sheets carried grain pressure through corrugations and bolted seams, while the roof, stiffeners, anchors, and foundation managed different loads. The shells had not been welded into permanent cylinders. They had been assembled from repeating parts. That meant the real question was not whether an old bin could be dragged whole across Harrow County. It was whether its parts could be indexed, dismantled, nested, hauled, and rebuilt in their original relationships. At the folding auction table, Alina opened the inventory packet again. The line read, 700 galvanized grain bins, as situated, removal required by September 30th, 1980. She copied it into the black notebook, dividing the purchase price by the count before anyone came to ask whether she intended to sign the check. $8,750 divided by 700 bins came to $12.50 per bin before removal. $12.50 did not buy the bolts for a new access door. It barely bought a service call in Bellwether. Yet it purchased the steel shell, roof sheets, stiffeners, ladders, transitions, and every usable fan component attached to one condemned structure. The low price did not mean the material lacked value. It meant the lender had assigned that value to someone willing to remove the liability. Alina closed the inventory packet, wrote the check from her personal account, and asked for 11 site keys and a signed receipt. Walter Kessler watched her from beside the auction clerk. His rust-red quilted vest was buttoned over a blue and white checked shirt, his gold-rim aviator glasses had slipped slightly down his rounded nose, and the brass Bellwether co-op counter key remained clipped to his belt as if he had come only to watch a foolish purchase and return to work. "You have a crew?" he asked. "Not yet. A crane." "I have rates, foundations, I have a site." Walter looked toward the rows of rust-streaked cylinders beyond the weeds. His sandy-gray sideburns shifted when he pressed his jaw together. "You have 29 months. I have 539 working days if weather takes the rest." Walter looked at her notebook, but Alina put it back in her shirt pocket. That evening, rain pressed a dark line across the west windows of the Voss kitchen. Alina laid the auction inventory beside 4 cost sheets, a county plat, a soil survey, and a hand-drawn arrangement of 24 small circles on 9 acres south of the cattle lots. Carl Voss washed his hands at the utility sink before he sat down. At 61, he was broad-shouldered and stocky, with weather-reddened skin, short iron-gray hair combed to the left, and a neatly trimmed gray mustache. He wore rectangular tortoiseshell glasses, a brown herringbone wool overshirt, tan canvas trousers, and dark brown work boots that he placed squarely beneath the chair. The polished brass plumb bob in the leather pouch at his belt touched the chair rung when he leaned forward. He read the auction receipt once. He read the removal deadline twice. He did not ask why she had done it before speaking to him because the check had come from her account and the risk had her name on it. He turned to the first cost sheet. Alina remained upright across from him, pale blue eyes fixed on the paper. She did not explain the circles or point to the totals. Carl had taught her that a figure needing rescue from its author was not ready for another person's money. He followed each column downward with a blunt fingertip, stopping at the crane allowance, the bolt estimate, the concrete, and the electrical work. Rain ticked against the kitchen glass. The refrigerator motor started, ran for 30 seconds, and stopped. Carl placed one finger on the bottom line of Alina's first cost sheet. "Let me tell you about Carl Voss, because you need to understand how he counted risk before you can understand why his permission mattered." Carl had survived lean cattle years without ever believing survival made him wiser than arithmetic. When feeder prices dropped, he did not speak about faith in the market. He counted hay. When a tractor transmission failed, he did not complain that the tractor ought to have lasted. He laid the gears on clean burlap, measured the unworn faces, and decided which parts could still carry load. His line was always the same: count what remains, not what is missing. He had said it over drought-stunted corn, broken sickle sections, a hail-marked machine shed roof, and a stack of used fence posts with 3 sound feet left below the rot. The words did not excuse damage. Carl had no affection for damage. They forced him to identify what still possessed measurable use before paying to replace the whole thing. Most people saw outdated bins and saw obsolete storage. Carl had taught Alina to see galvanized steel that had already survived wind, grain pressure, and decades of Iowa weather. He had not taught her grain storage design. Carl knew only the figure she had placed in front of him that night. He had never heard her describe a linked yard of smaller aerated cells, and he did not know she had been assembling the idea for years. The first book had cost $25 at a vocational school auction. It was a stained handbook on agricultural structures, missing its front cover and carrying pencil notes from an instructor who disagreed with 3 of the printed tables. Alina bought it because the chapters on corrugated shells included bolt spacing, sheet gauge, hoop stress, and the behavior of thin steel under distributed pressure. That handbook led her to others. Through the Bellwether Library, she requested engineering texts by interlibrary loan. Some arrived from Ames with due dates too short for leisurely reading, so she copied tables at the kitchen counter after chores. She studied thin-shell structures until she could follow how outward grain pressure became tension around a circular wall. She traced fan curves, learning that a fan did not deliver one fixed volume of air. Its output changed with resistance and grain depth. Kernel size, fines, ducts, and perforated flooring all added resistance. She filled pages with static pressure readings from fans she repaired. She noted motor horsepower, blade pitch, duct diameter, grain depth, and the difference between a clean sample and one loaded with broken kernels. She recorded corn temperature at dawn and again after sunset. She compared equilibrium moisture charts, learning when grain would absorb water from surrounding air and when moving air would dry it. None of this announced itself as preparation for 700 bins. It looked like a woman making too many notes. Carl turned the second sheet sideways. Alina had drawn 24 storage cells in 4 rows with a gravel lane between them and room for portable augers. Each circle carried a capacity, fan requirement, and owner code. "Why small ones?" he asked. "Separation. From what?" "From each other." She pulled a grain receipt from the notebook. The paper showed moisture, test weight, damage, foreign material, and the discount taken from a mixed delivery. A large bin could hold more grain with less wall and roof area per bushel. Alina knew that advantage. But one large bin also encouraged operators to combine loads that did not belong together. Corn harvested at different moisture levels behaved differently in storage. Grain with high fines resisted airflow. Soybeans required different handling. Seed grain had to remain distinct. Grain owned by separate farmers could not become one undifferentiated mass without records and assumptions. 24 smaller cells allowed 24 decisions. A farmer could isolate wetter corn and dry it without pushing heated air through an entire season's crop. Clean, heavy grain could remain apart from a lower-grade load that would drag down the price of everything around it. One owner's grain could be stored under that owner's name. Another could wait for a better bid without paying the discount created by a neighbor's moisture. Carl studied the discount on the receipt. "You would charge storage, per bushel per month with drying separate. And if the grain spoils, I pay. And if the bins are not ready, I own 700 piles of curved steel." Carl moved to the third sheet. It listed the Voss farm debt, reserves, and Alina's savings. The farm's $18,420 did not appear as available cash in her plan, neither did the land. Her $46,180 stood alone. She had estimated an opening outlay that left less than $3,000 between the project and the end of her personal savings. Carl saw it. His fingertip remained there longer than it had on any equipment line. Alina said nothing. He removed his tortoiseshell glasses, polished one lens with the tail of his pale blue chambray shirt, and put them back on. 3 faint freckles near his left temple disappeared beneath the frame. "What happens if your crane rate rises? I dismantle fewer bins the first season. What happens to the rest? I keep paying site insurance until they come down. What if the lender will not extend the deadline? They will not. What if concrete costs more? I reduce the first yard below 24. Carl looked at the circles again. That changes revenue. Yes. How much? Alina gave him the figure from memory, but he checked it against the sheet. It matched. The room remained quiet for nearly a minute. Carl did not laugh, object, or remind her that no one in Harrow County had asked for a privately operated yard assembled from condemned bins. He counted what remained in the steel, what remained in Alina's savings after the check cleared, and what remained of the farm if her plan failed. Finally, he stacked the papers in the order she had presented them. "I need to think about it." Alina nodded once. She returned the receipt to her notebook and left the cost sheets on the kitchen table. For the next 3 days, Carl did not mention the bins. He repaired a mineral feeder, hauled 2 loads of hay, and walked the south field with the brass plumb bob at his belt, though there was nothing there requiring a vertical line. Alina tested soil bearing capacity with a hand auger, marked drainage paths after rain, and telephoned 3 concrete contractors without promising work to any of them. Carl was not deciding whether Alina was clever. Cleverness did not pay a crane invoice. He was deciding whether 9 acres could be spared. whether access roads would interfere with cattle traffic, and whether allowing the project onto Voss land exposed the farm to claims Aliner had overlooked. On the third morning, he entered the machine shed while Aliner was sharpening an auger flight. He placed the leather pouch containing the brass plumb bob on the bench. The tool had belonged to Carl since his first year repairing barns. Its point was polished from touching foundation marks, and the brass body carried shallow scratches that no polishing removed. Aliner switched off the grinder. Carl did not give a speech. He had counted the land, the traffic, the drainage, the debt, and the distance between permission and rescue. 3 days later, Carl handed her the brass plumb bob and said, "Use 9 acres. Don't mortgage one. Let me tell you why 700 bins frightened experienced operators, because the purchase price was the cheapest line on the page." A standing bin looked simple from the road. It was a silver cylinder under a conical roof, held down by anchors and expected to remain where it had been erected. Removal reversed every decision made during construction, but the steel was older now, the bolts were rusted, and no factory crew had preserved the original bundles. Before a wrench touched a seam, workers had to remove old grain residue. Dust and spoiled kernels gathered in sumps, under floors, behind fan transitions, and along wall ledges. Electrical power had to be traced and disconnected rather than assumed dead. Motors, switches, conduit, temperature cables, ladders, vents, and access doors had to come off without turning usable parts into scrap. The shell itself could not simply be unbolted from the bottom. Corrugated steel carried load efficiently when joined into a complete circle, but an open circle could fold. Crews had to brace the wall, support the roof with crane tension, free the roof wedges, separate ring seams, and lower each section in an order that prevented the remaining shell from buckling in wind. Curved sheets then had to be nested for transport. Stiffeners had to remain identifiable. Roof ribs could not be tossed beneath wall panels. Hardware needed barrels, but barrels from different sites could not become one brown mixture if Aliner intended to learn which holes had stretched and which bolt diameters still matched. Every flatbed carried less steel than its deck suggested because curved sheets did not stack like lumber. Every crane hour began before the first panel moved. Every rainstorm converted an elevator yard into mud beneath loaded trucks. The deadline remained September 30th, 1980. Aliner had 2 full dismantling seasons and part of a third, but 700 bins meant she needed to average more than 1 completed dismantling on every usable working day. That was before construction began on the Voss acreage. She went to the Bellwether Co-op because Walter Kessler had spent 19 years behind its parts counter and knew where retired fan motors went after farms replaced them. Walter stood square behind the counter, his rust-red vest clean despite a morning of unloading belts and bearings. His feet turned outward when he walked toward the back shelves and the brass counter key tapped against his belt. "I need used axial fans between 7.5 and 10 horsepower, Aliner said. "Motors can need bearings, housings cannot be split." Walter stopped beside a stack of feed ledgers, for the roofs, for the bins. He returned to the counter. Aliner opened the black notebook and placed a panel map beneath his broad hand. Each bin had a site designation and number. Each wall sheet had a compass direction, vertical position, and ring level. Roof wedges had corresponding codes. Stiffeners, doors, transitions, and ladders carried the same parent designation. She intended to replace structural bolts and washers rather than truss fasteners that had already been torqued, weathered, and loosened. Walter followed the map through his gold-rimmed glasses. Aliner explained that bottom rings would remain bottom rings because they were often heavier gauge. Hole elongation would be measured before reuse. The shells would be rebuilt in their prior circumferential order when possible, preserving field-drilled relationships. Fan sizes would be selected against target airflow and expected static pressure, not copied from whatever motor happened to be attached at the abandoned site. The first 24 bins would form a yard on the Voss farm. Later clusters could be linked by telephone scheduling and common storage contracts, allowing grain to move among yards without requiring one enormous structure. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then he started laughing. It was a deep, surprised counterman's laugh, beginning in Walter's chest and breaking into 3 heavy breaths as he leaned one palm against the counter. There was no cruelty in it. Walter had watched farmers overspend on equipment, underestimate labor, and discover that used machinery carried the unpaid bill of whoever abandoned it. His laugh was the sound of long experience meeting something unfamiliar and mistaking unfamiliar for impossible. He removed his aviator glasses and wiped his eyes. Eleanor, those bins will cost more to move than they can ever earn. She waited until he put his glasses back on. The seams carry the load if they go back in order. Walter looked at the map again. The pale comma-shaped birthmark beside his left eyebrow tightened when he frowned. You cannot number your way out of crane time. No, and you cannot store grain in a drawing. No, you already paid for them. Yes. Walter rested both forearms on the counter. I have 2 used fans in the south shed. One has a bad bearing and the other was running when we pulled it. I would not buy either. I'll inspect them. He gave her the key. Eleanor did not argue with his estimate. Walter knew conventional removal, and under conventional removal he was right. Her plan depended on reducing confusion, preserving fit, reusing serviceable components, and spreading the purchase cost over enough working cells that $12.50 per bin remained meaningful after labor arrived. If the numbering failed, Walter's laugh would become arithmetic. By the end of April, Eleanor had bought 2 used pneumatic impact wrenches, enough hose to reach a compressor parked outside the dust, and an assortment of sockets. She contracted crane time in half-day blocks, with cancellation terms for high wind. She hired flatbeds by the loaded mile and negotiated a lower return rate when trucks carried empty hardware barrels back to the next site. Carl read each contract, but his name appeared on none of them. At Redfield, Eleanor walked the first bin clockwise. Her faded green jacket brushed the corrugated wall while she pressed yellow paint into each code. The cheap black notebook rested open on a wooden cable spool. At the top of the page she wrote, Redfield Bin 1, North Panel, Bottom Ring. The first crew arrived before daylight in scuffed boots and work gloves. Eleanor assigned 1 worker to hardware barrels, 1 to sheet codes, 2 to impact wrenches, and 1 to inspect every freed hole before a panel was nested. The crane operator waited for her signal before taking strain on the roof. Until that morning, Eleanor could still have sold the entire purchase to a scrap dealer and accepted a manageable loss. Once dismantling began, she would own labor invoices, scattered components, open shells, and a deadline advancing across 11 sites. She clipped Carl's brass plumb bob to her belt, checked the north mark, and raised 1 hand. At sunrise, the first roof sheet came down with a yellow code still visible on its underside. Let me tell you about the numbering system because you need to understand the holes before you can understand the failure. Eleanor's code began with the elevator site, followed by the bin number. After that came the compass direction, vertical panel position, ring level, and sequence around the circumference. A roof wedge received its radial position. A stiffener received the wall seam it reinforced. Fan transitions, access doors, vents, ladders, floor supports, and discharge parts carried their own references. The marks were repeated on the steel and in the notebook. If rain removed one, the other remained. Hardware barrels carried metal tags because paint on a barrel could be scraped away by a truck chain. From a distance, corrugated wall sheets looked interchangeable. They shared dimensions, curves, and rows of bolt holes, but years had made them less alike than they appeared. Lower rings often used heavier steel because grain pressure increased with depth. A top sheet placed at the bottom might align perfectly while lacking the thickness required to carry the load. Wind had worked some shells back and forth against their anchors, stretching holes in one direction. Repairs had introduced field-drilled holes that existed on only 2 neighboring sheets. Weathering had thinned exposed edges. Old installers had corrected manufacturing tolerances with specific overlaps, shims, and bolt patterns that disappeared if the sheets were mixed. Careless sorting would therefore create expensive choices. A crew could force misaligned holes with drift pins, but that distorted seams and concentrated load. They could drill new holes, but every extra opening removed steel from a highly stressed connection. They could discard troublesome panels, but enough discarded panels would turn $12.50 bins into incomplete circles. Eleanor preserved relationships before she preserved speed. At Redfield, the crane cable took light tension on the roof peak while workers removed vents and loosened roof wedges in opposing positions. The roof did not hang from the crane as a finished cap. It was stabilized by the cable while each wedge came free, preventing a half-open cone from folding under its own weight. Impact wrenches rattled along ring seams. Workers left selected bolts in place until lifting straps were ready, because a panel released too early could swing against the shell or crease at a whole line. Once free, curved sheets were lowered onto timber bunks, inspected, and nested by ring and sequence. Flatbeds carried the bundles to the Voss farm. Chains crossed over timber spacers rather than biting directly into corrugations. roof wedges rode above wall sheets. Stiffeners were bundled beside the panels they had supported. Labeled barrels held old bolts for reference, although Eleanor intended to use new structural fasteners during reconstruction. Nothing from Redfield entered a barrel marked for another site. The system cost time at the beginning. By the fourth bin, workers no longer had to ask where a panel belonged. By the ninth, Eleanor could open the notebook at the Voss yard and identify a missing northwestern roof wedge before the Redfield crew discovered it beneath a pile of ductwork. The dismantling operation began to move, but movement did not make it cheap. Let me tell you about the first 24-bin yard, because the total only makes sense when every line is allowed to stand where it belongs. The allocated purchase cost for 24 bins was $300. Crane time came to $1,920. Flatbed transport cost $1,260. One additional impact wrench cost $86, and sockets cost $34.50. Yellow markers cost $9.60. New structural bolts and washers came to $2,184. Eleanor would reuse wall sheets, roof wedges, stiffeners, ladders, and fan housings, but she would not build the yard around old fasteners whose threads had rusted, stretched, or been damaged during removal. Concrete was the largest line at $18,720. It included 24 reinforced foundations, anchor placement, floor supports, and the aprons required at access points. Electrical service, disconnects, conduit, motor protection, and wiring came to $4,860. Refurbished fans cost $1,440 after bearings, belts, guards, and motor testing. Sealant cost $612. Paid labor through the planned opening came to $3,360. The first 24-bin yard totaled $34,786.10. That total did not include the full auction purchase because only $300 of the $8,750 bid had been allocated to those first 24 bins. Cash, however, did not care about allocation. Eleanor had already paid for all 700. Therefore, the actual opening cash outlay, including the full auction purchase, stood at $43,236.10. Her personal savings had been $46,180. If the yard opened on budget, she would have $2,943.90 left before operating revenue. Carl read the itemized sheet at the kitchen table. He did not object to the thin margin because he had already placed a condition around the farm. "Count what remains, not what is missing," he said. Eleanor counted the cash remaining. She also counted what the money had purchased. A new equivalent 24-bin installation, with comparable combined capacity, aeration, electrical service, foundations, and access, had been priced at $211,680. That figure would have required finance construction and a lien against land or equipment. Eleanor's rebuilt yard demanded labor and discipline instead, but the difference between $34,786.10 and $211,680 was large enough to survive a great deal of careful work. The arithmetic held. The first shell did not. The 9-acre site had been graded to move surface water away from the foundations. Anchor bolts were set from templates. The first bottom ring arrived from Redfield in order, each yellow code corresponding to Eleanor's notebook. Workers stood the curved sheets, overlapped vertical seams, inserted new bolts, and joined the horizontal seam above them as the next ring rose. Every panel seemed to fit. Every hole was close. The crew used drift pins where necessary, tightened the fasteners, and continued upward. By the time Eleanor climbed down from the third ring, she could see that the access door did not stand directly above the foundation mark. One stiffener leaned inward. The top circumference no longer agreed with the roof curb. She measured across the shell once, moved 90 degrees, and measured again. The first rebuilt shell stood 2 3/4 inches out of round, and its roof would not seat. Eleanor measured the oval shell with Carl's brass plumb bob and 2 cross-diameter tapes. She hung the plumb bob from the upper ring beside the first stiffener. The polished point settled inside the foundation line. At the opposite stiffener, it settled outside. The cross tapes confirmed what the eye could already see. One diameter was 2 3/4 inches longer than the other, and the shell had become an oval assembled from parts that had formed a circle at Redfield. Nothing was missing. Nothing was obviously bent. Every worker had followed the panel codes and nearly every bolt had passed through its intended hole. That made the failure more dangerous because it invited the wrong conclusion. One worker blamed the foundation. Alina checked the anchor circle against the fixed survey marks. It held. Another blamed the old sheets. Alina measured the chord and curvature of 4 panels against their Redfield notes. They remained within the differences she had recorded. Carl stood outside the shell, broad shoulders tipped slightly forward, and watched her move the plumb bob from stiffener to stiffener. He did not offer a diagnosis. Alina climbed the ladder, loosened 3 bolts, and watched the upper seam move a fraction of an inch. The crew had tightened the horizontal seams before the complete ring was circular and plumb. Each individual misalignment had seemed small enough for a drift pin and impact wrench to overcome. A 1/16 of an inch disappeared beneath a washer. Another appeared at the next overlap. By the time those differences traveled around the circumference and upward through 3 rings, the tightened seams had locked the accumulated error into the shell. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time a machine failed because every individual part looked close enough? Close enough was the whole problem. Alina marked every tightened seam with chalk and told the crew to bring cable pullers. They backed nuts away from the steel without removing every bolt. The shell relaxed with a series of low metallic knocks. Alina established one fixed datum at the access door, then measured equal radii from the foundation center. Cable pullers drew the long diameter inward while timber braces pushed the short diameter outward. She crossed the tapes again. The first adjustment removed 1 1/8 inches. The second removed 7/8. The remaining 3/4 of an inch moved among 4 stiffeners as the workers changed tension. Alina hung the brass plumb bob at every stiffener, waiting for its point to stop moving before calling the reading. No seam was tightened merely because its holes aligned. The full ring had to close evenly first. Vertical seams remained snug enough to preserve overlap but loose enough to shift. Horizontal bolts were brought to contact in alternating positions around the circumference, much as wheel nuts were tightened across a hub rather than one after another around the rim. When the cross tapes agreed within 1/8 of an inch and every plumb line fell inside Alina's marked tolerance, the crew tightened the ring in stages. The roof curb settled into place without a drift pin. Walter Kessler drove past the Voss acreage that afternoon, slowing enough to see the first completed silver shell beyond the cattle lots. He did not turn in. Alina saw the rust-red vest through his truck window and returned to the bolt inspection. The first failure had cost 3 working days, 2 crane rescheduling fees, and enough labor to consume part of Alina's remaining cash. But it had changed the assembly method for every shell that followed. Rings would now remain adjustable until circumference, diameter, and plumb agreed. No impact wrench would make a geometric decision. The next shells rose more slowly at the first ring and faster above it. The 4th roof seated on the first attempt. The 8th stood plumb at every stiffener. By the time 12 bins faced the gravel lane, the crew treated Alina's datum marks as part of the structure rather than decoration. A circle, however, did not preserve grain. Alina fitted one rebuilt bin with a perforated floor, an underfloor plenum, and a refurbished axial fan. The fan housing came from Redfield. The motor had received new bearings and the blade clearance had been checked at 4 points. Its nameplate rating suggested ample airflow for the planned grain depth. She loaded the bin with corn for a controlled test, recording moisture, test weight, grain temperature, and fines. The first readings looked acceptable. Air emerged through the surface near the wall, lifting a strip of tissue she held above the grain. At the center, the tissue barely moved. Alina checked the fan rotation. It was correct. She checked voltage at the motor and current on each leg. Both were within limits. The underfloor plenum had no block transition, and the perforated floor had been swept before loading. She installed pressure taps at the fan transition and beneath the grain. The static pressure rose beyond the part of the fan curve where useful airflow remained. The motor continued turning, but the air volume through the grain column fell. A fan nameplate could state free air delivery, meaning the volume moved when resistance was low. Grain was not free air. Every foot of depth added resistance as air squeezed through spaces between kernels. Fines made those spaces smaller. Broken corn, dust, and light fragments migrated toward the center as grain entered through the roof inlet. There they formed a cone beneath the fill point. That cone was not solid in the way concrete was solid, but compared with clean corn it had low permeability. Air followed easier paths around it, rising near the outer grain column while the center received too little cooling and drying air. The bin appeared aerated because the fan ran and air moved somewhere. The center could still heat. Alina unloaded the test grain, screened samples at measured intervals, and weighed the fines. She changed the loading method to reduce concentration beneath the inlet, but the next test still produced a dense central core. She tried leveling the grain surface, yet leveling redistributed the top without removing the fines already buried below it. The pressure readings remained high. She compared them with the fan curve copied into her notebook. At the measured resistance, the refurbished fan delivered far less air than the nominal rating suggested. Increasing motor size would not automatically solve the distribution problem. A larger fan might drive more air through the easy paths while leaving the central cone underserved, and higher pressure would increase electrical cost across every bin. The system needed a way to manage fines, depth, and air paths together. September arrived with 11 shells standing and concrete committed for 13 more. Alina had paid crane invoices for bins not yet reconstructed. Dismantled sheets occupied timber bunks across the south edge of the acreage. The lender's removal deadline had not moved. Her remaining cash had narrowed to an amount that could disappear under one electrical failure or 1 week of delayed flatbeds. The fan breaker tripped during an evening test. Alina reset it, reduced the grain depth in her calculation, and started the fan again. The breaker held for 9 minutes before tripping a second time. She shut off the disconnect and remained beside the silent housing. Dust clung to her dark straight-leg denim jeans. Her scuffed brown work boot stood in spilled kernels below the transition. The copper auburn braid had loosened against the back of her faded green jacket, and the brass plum bob at her belt reflected the single work light. Carl had gone inside 2 hours earlier. He had offered no reassurance because reassurance could not change static pressure. Alina climbed the ladder and pushed a grain probe toward the center. The sample came up warm enough to confirm that air distribution was failing where her readings said it would fail. In the equipment shed, she opened the black notebook beside the auction inventory. She listed what could be sold. Galvanized sheets had scrap value. Refurbished motors could be resold. The crane contracts could be canceled with penalties. Unused bolts might be returned if the supplier accepted opened containers. Concrete could not be recovered, but the foundations might support different bins someday. She calculated liquidation value line by line, subtracting hauling, contract penalties, and the cost of cutting steel too damaged to sell intact. The figure would preserve part of her original savings. It would also leave the Voss acreage with empty foundations, 11 incomplete shells, and stacks of labeled panels that had crossed Harrow County to become scrap after all. For the first time since the auction, quitting was not an insult spoken by someone at a counter. It was a defensible financial decision written in Alina's own hand. She reread the airflow measurements. The fan had performed as its curve predicted. The grain had resisted air as grain with concentrated fines would resist it. Nothing mysterious had occurred. Her storage plan depended on preserving separate cells, but separation meant little if one warm core could spoil a bin from the center outward. Carl's line returned without offering comfort. Count what remains, not what is missing. What remained was steel, foundations, fans, notes, and a problem she had not yet solved. What was missing was time purchased with cash she no longer had. The equipment shed clock moved past 11. Alina totaled the liquidation column once, checked it twice, and drew a line beneath the failed pressure readings. Near midnight, Alina wrote one sentence beneath the failed airflow readings: "Sell the steel before winter." Let me tell you what Alina heard in that failing fan, because it was not a motor problem. The motor was doing exactly what the plate on its housing said it could do, drawing current, turning the shaft, and pushing air against resistance until the breaker protected the wiring from the demand she had created. The trouble lay beyond the blades, inside the grain and above it, where air had to find a path through packed fines, and then escape through a roof never designed for the volume Alina expected the fan to move. She did not tear the liquidation page from the notebook. She left it where she had written it, closed the black cover, and walked to the farmhouse for the discarded vocational handbook she had bought in a box of manuals for 25 cents. Its binding had separated near the chapters on static pressure, and 2 pages carried a dark thumbprint from someone who had studied the same problem years before her. Alina brought it back to the equipment shed, set it beside the copied fan curve, and sharpened a pencil with Carl's pocket knife. The handbook treated an aeration system as one continuous path. Air entered the fan, crossed the transition, spread through the plenum, past the perforated floor, worked upward through the grain, and left through the roof vents. Restriction anywhere changed performance everywhere. Aliner had measured beneath the floor and near the fan, but she had treated the roof as though air simply disappeared when it reached the grain's surface. It did not. She plotted measured static pressure along the horizontal scale of the fan curve and drew upward until her pencil met the performance line. The intersection showed the air volume the fan was actually delivering. Then she calculated the open area in the original roof vents. Even with clean grain, the exhaust openings were too small. Warm, moisture-laden air reached the roof, slowed, and created back pressure. Beneath it, the central fines column restricted the upward path. Grain depth increased both problems because every additional foot added resistance while reducing the airflow available per bushel. 3 restrictions had been behaving like one failure. At 1:30 in the morning, Aliner crossed out "Sell the steel before winter" with 2 straight pencil lines. The words remained readable. Beneath them she wrote, "Count what remains, not what is missing." She slept for 4 hours. The following morning, Carl entered the equipment shed looking for a grease gun. His brown herringbone overshirt was buttoned against the September chill, and the polished brass plumb bob was absent from its leather pouch because Aliner still carried it. He found the notebook open beside the handbook. He read the liquidation calculation, the crossed-out sentence, and the pressure figures beneath it. He said nothing. That afternoon, Carl bought a brown cloth-bound ledger at the Bellwether stationery counter. On the first page, he entered the date, the cost of the first rebuilt shell, and the quoted price of its new equivalent. He subtracted one from the other, but he did not call the difference profit. He labeled the column "Avoided Purchase." Beside it, he made another column for useful hours earned by the reused steel. Nobody had asked him to keep either figure. Aliner began with the grain inlet. She built a simple spreader beneath the roof opening from a conical plate and adjustable vanes. Falling grain struck the plate and moved outward instead of dropping in one narrow stream. The device did not remove fines because broken particles still separated according to size and motion, but it reduced the concentration beneath the center inlet and distributed the load more evenly across the floor. She also changed the loading procedure. After the bin received its full lot, the first grain withdrawn through the center sump was not treated as ordinary outbound grain. That withdrawal, called coring, removed the column where fines and broken kernels had collected. Aliner calculated the core volume by bin diameter and grain depth, then continued withdrawal until inspection samples showed the fines concentration approaching that of the surrounding grain. The removed material could be cleaned, fed, sold separately, or returned after screening. It could not remain hidden in the center merely because the roof looked level. Next came the exhaust. Aliner measured the fan's expected air delivery at operating static pressure rather than using its free air rating. She sized additional roof vents so outgoing air could leave without excessive velocity or back pressure. Each vent received a weather hood and screen, but the combined net open area mattered more than the number of hoods. Screens reduced effective area, especially when dust gathered on them, so she allowed for that loss rather than counting the frame dimensions as open space. She cut inspection ports where a worker could take pressure readings and check the plenum without unloading the bin. Temperature probes reached the center and outer grain columns at several heights. A single warm reading would no longer be dismissed as a bad thermometer because its position could be compared with the pressure and airflow pattern around it. The corrected test began with clean perforations, an empty plenum, open roof vents, and a known grain depth. Aliner loaded slowly through the spreader, stopped twice to inspect distribution, and withdrew the first central load after filling. Dust and cracked kernels appeared heavily in the opening flow, then declined as the core cleared. She sealed the access point and started the fan. The belt came up to speed without a squeal. Tissue strips lifted at measured positions across the grain surface, including the center, but Aliner trusted the gauges more than the tissue. She recorded pressure beneath the floor at 4 ports, then moved around the shell in measured heel-first steps, her copper auburn braid resting against the faded green canvas jacket and the cheap black notebook open in one hand. The readings differed slightly because no grain bed was perfectly uniform, but they stabilized within the range she had marked from the handbook. The breaker held through the first hour. It held through the afternoon. After sunset, Carl carried a lantern to the bin and found Aliner beside the fan transition, thin silver wire-rim glasses reflecting the gauge face. He handed her the brown ledger. The first page showed the avoided purchase value of the shell, the hours of fan operation, and 3 labor entries Carl had copied from the crew sheets. "What is this?" Alina asked. "What remains?" he said. She turned the page. Carl had left room for every rebuilt bin. The next morning, the center probe showed no hidden rise in temperature. Airflow across the perforated floor remained even enough to carry heat and moisture upward, while the enlarged roof exhaust released the damp air instead of trapping it beneath the cone. Alina shut down the fan, waited, and restarted it to see whether the pressure pattern returned. It did. The system held. October 1978. Alina applied the corrected design to every shell under construction. Grain spreaders were fabricated in batches. Roof vent openings were cut before the upper sheets went into place. Inspection ports received numbered caps corresponding to pages in the notebook. Each fan was tested against its own curve because 2 housings that looked alike could carry different blades, motors, and operating histories. Progress remained slower than she wanted. Crane invoices arrived before storage receipts existed, and concrete consumed cash whether a bin earned anything or not. Therefore, Alina reopened the dismantling contracts, shifted some half-day crane blocks, and completed 12 additional foundations only after the first 12 shells passed pressure tests. She would not duplicate an unproven error merely to make the yard look busy. By August of 1979, 24 bins stood in 4 straight rows on the 9 permitted acres. Their capacities varied because the original elevator sites had used several diameters and wall heights, but together they held 176,400 bushels. Each cell had a numbered owner record, a fan sheet, a moisture log, and an inspection schedule. Carl entered every useful hour in the brown ledger. The silver roofs could be seen from the county road, but appearance was the least important thing about them. They were separate. By the first week of October, 24 separate cells were waiting for a harvest the co-op could not hold. Let me tell you about 8,400 bushels of corn, because that one lot changed what 3 counties thought storage was worth. It belonged to Harold Meeks, a 46-year-old Harrow County farmer who arrived at the Voss yard after sunset with his collar unbuttoned, corn dust on his sleeves, and 4 loaded wagons waiting behind a tandem truck. Bellwether Co-op had reached working capacity that afternoon. Walter Kessler had trucks backed along the scale lane, temporary grain piling against a receiving wall, and wetter loads arriving faster than the dryer could handle them. The easy response was blending. A load averaging 15.1% moisture could be mixed into grain running near 17.2%, giving the co-op a larger mass it could dry and handle as one inventory. Easy handling did not mean a fair settlement for Harold. Alina sampled each wagon with a probe long enough to reach beyond the dry surface grain. She combined the increments, divided the sample, tested moisture, and checked test weight. The readings held close enough to treat the 8,400 bushels as one lot. Harold had brought sound corn at 15.1% moisture, but if it entered the mixed co-op mass, its identity would disappear before the first auger stopped. "Can you keep it mine?" he asked. "Yes," Alina said. She assigned the lot to a single aerated cell with enough capacity to preserve headspace below the roof. On the record sheet she entered Harold Meeks, 8,400 bushels, 15.1% moisture, the measured test weight, the receiving date, the bin number, and the starting fan hours. She filled a glass sample jar, sealed the lid with numbered tape, and attached the matching number to the scale ticket. Harold signed beneath the entry. The grain entered through the spreader. Alina watched the motor load while the auger ran because uneven feed could bury one side of the spreader and recreate the concentration she had designed it to prevent. When the final wagon emptied, she withdrew the first central load through the sump. The opening grain carried the expected excess of fines. She continued coring until screened samples showed the center approaching the lot average, then weighed the withdrawn amount and recorded where it went. A bulk bin rewards speed. Grain arrives, disappears into a larger mass, and leaves according to the requirements of the whole mass. Separation requires more records, more switching, and more attention to empty space, but it preserves differences that already exist. Harold's corn did not need to inherit the drying requirement of grain at 17.2%. It did not need its test weight diluted by lighter corn or its grade reduced by damage hidden elsewhere in the pile. Moisture also moves within stored grain after loading. A warm interior can drive moist air upward, where it cools near the roof and condenses beneath cold steel. A damp pocket can therefore form even when the average sample appears safe. Fines worsen the pocket by reducing airflow and holding moisture where a worker cannot see it. When several owners and moisture levels share one mass, a problem beginning in one region can affect every bushel surrounding it. Aliner's small cell placed a boundary around Harold's risk. A warm spell arrived 6 days after loading. Afternoon temperatures climbed, but nights cooled enough to create temperature differences inside poorly managed grain. Aliner ran the fan during conditions that moved the grain toward a uniform temperature without drawing unnecessary dampness into it. The enlarged roof vents released exhaust air. Pressure readings held across the floor. Probes in the center, middle radius, and outer column showed no developing heat pocket. Harold came twice during the warm spell. The first time he stood beside Aliner while she opened an inspection port and checked the plenum. "Smells like corn," he said. "That is the plan," Aliner replied. The second time he brought coffee in a steel flask and did not ask whether the bin was working. He asked what the fan hours had reached. Aliner showed him the sheet. At settlement, Walter's scale records provided the comparison. The co-op's combined drying, handling, grade, and moisture adjustments on the mixed alternative would have reduced Harold's return by 31 cents per bushel. Aliner checked the figure against the preserved sample, the receiving ticket, and the final condition of the lot. 31 cents across 8,400 bushels came to $2,604. That was not a paper value assigned to old steel. It was money Harold did not lose because his grain had remained his grain. He paid Aliner's storage and aeration charge without bargaining, folded the settlement sheet into his shirt pocket, and asked whether she had room for soybeans. Word traveled before Aliner answered him. A driver waiting at the bellwether scale heard Harold describe the sealed sample jar. Walter's bookkeeper saw the separate tickets and asked for a blank copy of Aliner's owner record. 2 farmers from Ashby County drove through the Voss yard on Sunday afternoon, counting roofs from inside their pickup. One of them returned Monday with moisture readings from 3 fields and wanted to know whether Aliner would reserve a cell before harvest reached them. She did not reserve space on promises. She required a commodity, an estimated volume, and a deposit credited against the final charge. Every accepted lot received a cell assignment before it entered the yard. Grain of similar ownership and condition could share a bin only under written terms. Aliner was building capacity, but she would not rebuild the mixed problem on a smaller foundation. The first yard filled to 171,260 bushels, leaving working space for safe loading and aeration rather than forcing grain into every available cubic foot. Receipts for storage, aeration, handling, and testing reached $27,401.60. Operating expense came to $7,864.20. Electricity accounted for $1,891.40. Paid yard labor came to $2,480. Auger fuel and maintenance cost $1,136.80. Insurance, testing supplies, scale charges, replacement belts, record forms, snow removal, and minor repairs made up the remaining $2,356. Carl entered the receipts and expenses in the brown ledger, but he kept the avoided purchase column separate. Aliner used the operating margin to pay outstanding crane work, replenish structural fasteners, and reserve concrete for the next row. The money did not leave the yard to improve the farmhouse or replace her truck. It returned to steel. November 7, 1979, Walter Kessler arrived after the Bellwether Co-op had closed. He parked beside the outer row and sat behind the wheel long enough for the fan on Harold's bin to complete another steady revolution of its belt. When he stepped out, the rust-red quilted vest was zipped over his checked shirt, his brass counter key remained clipped to his belt, and his outward-turning gait carried him directly toward Aliner. She was tightening an inspection cap. Her faded green canvas jacket showed a dark line of grease at the cuff. Carl stood near the office door with the brown ledger under one arm, but Walter had not come to speak with him. Walter looked at the pressure log, the sealed sample jar, and Harold's settlement comparison. He had managed grain long enough to know what each figure meant. His laugh at the counter had never been cruel, but it had been certain. The certainty was gone. Walter stood beneath the running fan, removed his glasses, and said, "I was wrong." The admission left him looking at the black leather shoes he kept clean behind the co-op counter. He wiped his gold-rimmed aviator glasses with a folded handkerchief, replaced them, and did not soften the sentence by explaining what he had meant at the auction. "I have 6 centrifugal fans," he said. Serviceable housings, motors need testing. I'll need the curves if you have them, Alina said. I have 4, I can find the other 2. Walter offered her first refusal at $110 per fan, less than the value of the housings and wheels as replacement equipment. More important, he offered something his position made useful. Bellwether would send overflow loads to the Voss yard under written rules preserving owner, grade, moisture, weight, sample number, and assigned cell. No load would leave the co-op scale without a matching record. Walter would not ask a leaner to absorb mixed grain merely to clear his lane. The following morning, his bookkeeper delivered carbon forms and fan folders in a co-op envelope. Carl waited until the office door closed. Then he removed the brown ledger from beneath his wool overshirt and placed it beside Alina's cheap black notebook. The avoided purchase column had reached $183,612.40 after adjustments for the equipment they had actually installed. The useful hours pages ran farther. "You were right," he said. Nothing more was added. Carl took the brass plumb bob from Alina's belt pouch, polished grain dust from its point with his thumb, and returned it. By noon he was setting foundation templates for the next row. December 1979. One faint fan belt squeal changed the scale of the operation. Alina heard it while collecting Bellwether's second overflow records. The sound came from a large co-op bin near the far receiving leg, a brief high note each time the belt crossed one spot on the pulley. Walter had scheduled a replacement, but Alina stopped because the squeal carried an uneven load beneath it. The fan motor settled, strained, and settled again. She asked how long the bin had been running. "Since yesterday morning," Walter said. The mixed bin held grain from multiple farms, received across different days and moisture levels. Its average reading sat inside the co-op's management range, but average moisture described the arithmetic of the samples, not the location of water inside the bin. Alina checked the roof exhaust first. Damp air left one vent strongly and barely moved through another. At a center temperature cable, the upper reading had climbed. A probe sample taken below it smelled faintly sweet, the first stage before heating grain became sour or moldy. Beneath the fill point, a column of fines had trapped a damp pocket while air moved more readily around it. The fan was not failing. It was working against a resistance pattern that changed as moisture and temperature shifted inside thousands of bushels. Walter shut down the fill conveyor and began transferring grain. The heated pocket had not spread far enough to ruin the entire bin, but reaching it required moving sound grain that surrounded it. Every owner represented inside the mass shared the handling delay, energy cost, and grade risk created by one hidden region. Alina watched grain pour from the central sump and understood that Harold's avoided discount had proved only the smallest part of her plan. Large bins reduced the number of walls, roofs, motors, and transfers required per bushel. They were efficient when grain entered at similar condition, remained properly distributed, and could be managed as one lot. But mixed moisture, grade, and ownership linked every bushel to the same internal failure. A damp pocket in one location became a correlated loss. Many smaller cells changed that relationship. They required more shells and careful records, but a problem remained bounded by one owner, one condition, or one manageable volume. Grain needing more drying could receive more fan time without charging every neighboring bushel for electricity. High test weight grain could retain its grade. Soybeans, oats, seed grain, and feed corn could occupy separate cells without waiting for one central facility to clear an entire mass. Let me tell you about Alina's network, because the bins did not become useful merely by standing apart. She linked them with things that could move. Portable augers served several rows rather than being fixed permanently to one shell. One calibrated moisture tester traveled in a padded case between yards, checked against reference samples before each receiving day. Temperature probes followed a standard placement pattern. Fan records used the same pressure points and hour columns regardless of county. Roads became part of the storage equipment. A farm near Dunlin County did not need to haul past a closer yard merely because the Voss acreage contained the office. Each location could receive, sample, weigh, aerate, and release its own loads while Alina's records preserved where every bushel belonged. Common procedures made separate yards operate like one system without making their grain one mass. The lender had looked at 11 failed elevator sites and seen 700 structures that had to be removed before land could be sold cleanly. Alina now saw pre-engineered shells already divided into wall sheets, roof wedges, stiffeners, doors, ladders, and fan transitions. Their foundations could not travel, but their modular steel could be placed near the farms producing the grain. The demolition liability had become an inventory whose value increased as distance to the customer decreased. Walter began marking county names beside open cells on a yellow pad behind the bellwether counter. He referred only loads Aliner had agreed to accept, and he recorded fan capacity because wet grain could not be assigned according to empty volume alone. A cell without enough airflow was not available merely because its roof covered space. The second bellwether overflow load entered under written separation rules. Aliner checked the owner number against the scale ticket, sealed the sample jar, and entered the opening fan hours. The office telephone rang before she finished the line. A Dunlin County operator had 3 trucks waiting, a dryer behind schedule, and 11,000 bushels that could not remain on wagons through the forecast rain. He had heard that Aliner kept lots separate. "Can you?" he asked. "I can hold 6,800, she said. "The rest needs another place." The operator accepted before she finished stating the rate. The telephone rang from Dunlin County before Aliner finished entering Bellwether's second overflow load. "Let me tell you how 700 bins left 11 elevator sites, because the deadline never moved for Aliner's success. The lender had required every structure removed by September 30th, 1980. Full yards, working fans, and calls from neighboring counties did not purchase one additional day. Aliner took the first storage receipts and divided them before spending any. Operating expense remained in one account. Taxes and insurance remained in another. Everything beyond the reserve returned to removal and reconstruction. She bought crane days, concrete, new fasteners, butyl seam compound, fan bearings, belts, electrical disconnects, and flatbed miles. She borrowed nothing against the Voss farm. Demand had proved that additional cells could earn money, but future earnings could not safely pay an invoice due Friday. Aliner therefore expanded only when the previous group of bins had generated enough cash to fund the next. The method looked slow beside borrowed construction. It was faster than foreclosure. January 1980. Snow covered the dismantled sites, but Aliner used frozen ground where it improved truck access. Crews removed roof vents and fan housings indoors when possible, then waited for wind limits before opening shells. Yellow codes were refreshed on weathered panels. Timber spacers kept nested sheets above frozen mud. Hardware barrels returned empty to the next elevator site, exactly as her hauling contracts required. At the Voss acreage, unreconstructed panels began to occupy more space than standing bins. Aliner could not allow the permitted 9 acres to become an unsorted pile. She laid timber racks in rows corresponding to elevator site and original bin number. Bottom rings remained separated from lighter upper sheets. Roof wedges were nested by radial sequence. Stiffeners rested beside the seams they had reinforced, and ladders were wired to metal tags. Every bundle could wait without forgetting what it had been. The old galvanized panels remained useful because zinc had protected the underlying steel from ordinary atmospheric corrosion. Aliner rejected sheets with deep white corrosion near trapped moisture, severe red rust where zinc had failed, cracks at bolt holes or creases crossing load paths. Sound galvanizing did not make the panel new, but it preserved enough section and stiffness for inspection, repair, and reuse. Fasteners were different. Bolts carried clamp load across every seam, and their condition could not be judged merely by whether the head still looked solid. Threads damaged by impact removal altered tightening. Corrosion reduced cross-section. Previous installation could have stretched a bolt beyond the range where it returned fully after loading. Aliner used new grade 8 bolts where the design and hole size called for them, with new nuts and sealing washers. The grade marking did not excuse careless tightening. A stronger bolt could still crush thin sheet around a hole or create uneven seam pressure if driven without sequence. Workers brought connections to contact, checked geometry, and tightened in stages. Sealing washers compressed enough to close around the opening without being squeezed out beneath the head. Between overlapping sheets, Aliner applied butyl seam compound. Butyl remained flexible, adhered to clean galvanized surfaces, and resisted water entry as the steel expanded and contracted. Hard-setting material could crack when a wall moved under grain pressure or changed dimension with temperature. Aliner cleaned dirt, old sealant, and loose oxidation from every overlap before applying the new bead. Sealing over contamination would preserve the contamination, not the seam. Spring receipts funded additional concrete in Harrow County and the first leased yard in Dunlin County. Alina would not sign a lease that made improvements collateral for unrelated debt. She negotiated a fixed-term, renewal options, road access, electrical rights, and removal provisions for the bins. Carl read every line at the kitchen table and asked what happened if the land changed owners. Alina returned with that question until the answer appeared in writing. By the 1980 harvest, 58 rebuilt bins provided 431,200 bushels across the Harrow and Dunlin yards. The cells did not share identical capacity, so Alina kept a wall chart listing usable bushels, commodity restrictions, fan performance, and current occupancy for each one. A bin's nominal volume was reduced when grain depth had to remain below a level its airflow could manage safely. Walter turned his yellow counter pad into a referral sheet. Down the left side he listed Harrow, Dunlin, and Ashby counties. Across the top he listed commodity, open capacity, moisture range, and fan capability. Farmers calling Bellwether could be directed toward a suitable cell rather than merely the nearest empty roof. Walter updated the sheet only from Alina's signed availability notices. He did not make a ceremony of helping her. He made the sheet accurate. July 1980. The last standing shells at the 11th elevator site waited behind a collapsed scale house. Alina scheduled 2 cranes because using one would push removal into the autumn wind season. The extra crane cost more per day, but missing the deadline would expose her to penalties, emergency demolition rates, and the loss of material still standing. She paid the invoice from storage receipts and reduced reconstruction work for 6 weeks. Flatbeds moved continuously between the site and the Voss acreage. Carl supervised timber racks while Alina stayed with the dismantling crew. His short, even steps traveled each row before a driver released chains. If a bundle tag disagreed with the notebook, the truck remained loaded until the discrepancy was found. August brought heat that softened road shoulders and forced heavier loads onto morning schedules. One crane lost a hydraulic hose. Alina shifted workers to sheet inspection and hardware sorting rather than paying them to watch the repair. A thunderstorm stopped roof work for 2 days. The deadline lost nothing. September 29, 1980. One dismantled roof remained on the ground at the final site, along with 2 bundles of wall sheets, a ladder, 3 stiffeners, and tagged barrels of reference hardware. The lender's representative arrived before noon and asked whether Alina intended to leave the timber blocking. "It belongs to me," she said. "It leaves too." The last flatbed reached the Voss acreage after dark. Headlights moved along the timber racks while Carl directed it to the row marked with the final site code. Alina checked the metal tags under a flashlight, then compared them with the cheap black notebook. 700 original bin records now ended with one word: removed. On September 30th, Alina returned to the 11 sites with the lender's representative. Concrete foundations remained because the auction had covered structures as situated, not excavation of every foundation. The grain bins, fan housings, ladders, doors, roof vents, and loose components included in Alina's inventory were gone. The representative signed the completion form at 4:20 in the afternoon. Alina folded the form into the notebook and drove home. The 9 acres looked crowded with possibility and nearly impossible to anyone who did not understand the codes. Timber racks held nested galvanized panels by original site, bin, and ring. Roof wedges formed silver stacks beneath weighted covers. Stiffeners lay on raised bunks. The material had met the deadline, but most of it had not yet earned 1 hour in Carl's ledger. That became the next pressure. Winter storage receipts funded fan rebuilding in batches of 6. Alina tested motor insulation, replaced rough bearings, checked wheel balance, measured blade clearance, and recorded current draw after installation. A fan that vibrated on the shop floor would not improve after being bolted to a bin transition. Belts were aligned across pulley faces, guards were repaired, and every housing received a number matching its performance sheet. Concrete crews resumed as soon as spring ground allowed. Ashby County became the 3rd yard because its farms sat far enough from Bellwether to make harvest hauling expensive, but close enough for Alina's portable testing equipment and repair truck to serve without duplication. She purchased the yard parcel outright from accumulated receipts. The deed carried no farm lien. By June of 1981, 96 rebuilt bins provided 721,600 bushels across 3 paid-for yards. Alina's black notebook had been joined by 6 shelf ledgers, 3 county charts, and Carl's brown book of avoided purchases and useful hours. Walter's referral sheet hung beside the bellwether scale phone, its columns rewritten whenever a cell filled or cleared. Beyond the yards, machinery dealers were extending terms to operations whose land values had risen faster than their cash income. Variable rates reset upward. Farmers who had borrowed for acres, equipment, and storage discovered that one payment could change while the crop beneath it had not. Carl read the financial pages at the kitchen table and placed the brass plumb bob on the margin where a leaner had written the balance on each yard. Harrow owed nothing. Dunlin owed nothing. Ashby owed nothing. You know what 18% interest did to operations that borrowed to expand in the late 70s? It turned a sound harvest into an insufficient payment, moved principal farther away after every renewal, and made paid-for equipment worth less at auction precisely when families needed it to be worth more. The Voss yards were full of grain, but they carried no note against the farm and no construction loan whose rate could reset. Their growth had been limited by receipts, crane schedules, concrete, and a leaner's refusal to spend money before steel earned it. That limit had cost her speed. Now it bought time. By June of 1981, 96 rebuilt bins stood across 3 paid-for yards. You know what 18% interest did to operations that borrowed to expand in the late 70s? It turned useful land and new steel into payment schedules the crop could not carry. A concrete foundation could be level, a dryer could run exactly as its manufacturer intended, and a receiving leg could move grain faster than the old one it replaced, but none of that changed the figure printed beside interest on a renewal note. By August, corn prices had fallen far enough that farmers delayed selling whenever their operating lenders allowed it. Soybeans remained in farm bins while owners waited for a recovery that might cover fertilizer, fuel, seed, and machinery payments already due. The grain had value, but the date on the note arrived before the price improved. Conventional elevators carried their own version of the same problem. Several had expanded, receiving pits, dryers, legs, and large storage tanks while credit was available at variable rates. Those improvements produced capacity, but the debt remained whether the tanks were full or empty. When lenders demanded principal reduction, managers could not mail them airflow, concrete, or the extra bushels a new leg might handle next autumn. They needed cash that season. Let me tell you about the first hard month at the Voss yards, because paid-for steel did not make a leaner immune to a falling market. It merely changed which problem reached her gate. September 1981. The Harrow yard received fewer early loads than a leaner had scheduled. At Dunlin, 3 customers asked whether their first storage bills could wait until grain sold. Ashby received corn slowly because 2 operators could not secure enough operating credit to keep hired trucks moving. Electricity, insurance, testing supplies, and labor still had to be paid. Fan bearings did not care what corn was worth. A leaner stood at the Harrow office desk in her faded green canvas jacket, her copper auburn braid resting against one shoulder, and worked through the expected receipts in the cheap black notebook. Her pale blue eyes stopped behind thin silver wire-rim glasses whenever a customer's promise depended on a price recovery rather than a date. She did not mistake those promises for dishonesty. The farmers owed her because someone else owed them, and the entire county seemed to be waiting for the same dollar to arrive. Carl entered with the brown ledger beneath his herringbone wool overshirt. He placed his brass plumb bob beside the notebook and compared the reduced volume with the cash reserve. His weather-reddened face did not change when a leaner showed him how far October receipts might fall below plan. "Count what remains, not what is missing," he said. The line had guided foundation work when a pile of discarded panels looked smaller than 700 bins. Now Carl used it on money. Lower revenue was not insolvency. Delayed receipts were not the same as unrecoverable accounts. The yard still owned their shells, foundations, fans, electrical work, roads, portable augers, testing equipment, and every hour of storage not pledged to a lender. Harrow owed nothing. Dunlin owed nothing. Ashby owed nothing. A leaner therefore changed the billing interval without changing the obligation. Customers who could not settle an entire season at release could pay storage monthly, with each invoice tied to owner number, measured bushels, commodity, cell, fan hours, and test records. A farmer could see what remained in storage and what each month cost. Grain could not leave until the account terms were met, but a leaner would not force a sale merely to make her annual billing convenient. She also refused to make unsecured cash advances against stored grain. 2 customers asked. One offered her a favorable share of any later price gain. Alina listened, checked the owner records, and answered in the same plain voice she had used at Walter Kessler's counter. "I can store it. I can't finance it." That boundary preserved more than cash. If Alina borrowed to advance money to customers, the network would inherit the same timing risk pressing on the farms and elevators around it. A lower crop price could then weaken the owner, the storage account, and Alina's lender claim at once. By keeping title clear, lots separate, and bills documented, she gave customers time without pretending storage was a bank. October brought wetter corn than forecast. The lower total volume did not reduce the care required for what arrived. Alina assigned grain according to moisture and fan performance, leaving cells empty when their airflow could not safely manage the intended depth. Carl checked pressure logs before sunrise. Walter updated Bellwether's referral sheet whenever a Voss cell closed to additional loads. The 3 yards took grain in smaller lots, some only a few hundred bushels, because one owner's financial trouble did not make his grain physically unmanageable. The network handled 684,920 bushels that season. Storage, aeration, handling, testing, and release charges earned $123,285.60. Expenses reached $46,774.30. Carl separated the figures line by line. Electricity and motor service took $13,642.10. Yard labor and seasonal receiving help cost $14,890. Auger fuel, truck expense, and repairs came to $6,911.40. Insurance, testing supplies, scale fees, snow removal, office records, taxes, and minor concrete repair consumed the remaining $11,330.80. The arithmetic left $76,511.30 before reinvestment and reserves. It was less than Alina had projected during the summer, but nothing in that subtraction carried an interest reset. No machinery company held title to the augers. No bank could call the concrete due. No lender could take the bins without first proving ownership of steel Alina had bought, dismantled, hauled, rebuilt, and paid for from receipts. One night in December, Alina remained alone in the Harrow office after the final fan check. Wind pressed corn snow against the lower rings, and a customer's unpaid invoice rested beside an estimate for spring concrete. She could preserve the cash reserve by postponing the next cluster. She could also use the reserve to keep rebuilding while local contractors were hungry for work. Either choice could be defended. For 20 minutes, she considered stopping at 96 bins. The black notebook lay open to the original inventory language, followed by Carl's condition in the same section of worn pages. Don't mortgage one. Alina turned to the county occupancy charts. The cells had earned enough to build more, but only if overdue accounts were not counted as available cash. She crossed 3 proposed foundations from the spring schedule and approved the remainder. Growth would be slower again. It continued. February 1982. A farm auction east of Bellwether drew more lenders than neighbors. Tractors stood in rows with debt balances larger than their bids. A nearly new dryer sold for less than its owner had paid toward principal. Along the road home, white foreclosure notices appeared beneath mailbox flags and on gates where operating notes had been secured by land. At Harrow, Dunlin, and Ashby, fans continued according to temperature rather than the mood of the credit market. Monthly payments arrived in envelopes, sometimes 10 days late, sometimes in amounts written after a farmer had sold only one separated lot. Alina entered each receipt against its owner code. Carl entered what remained. When the foreclosure notices appeared on neighboring gates, none appeared on Alina's storage yards. Let me tell you what steady growth looks like, because it does not look like a ribbon cutting. It looks like a concrete crew leveling one more circular pad before rain, a repaired fan motor drying on a bench, and a bundle tag being checked twice because a wall sheet from one shell must not be mistaken for the same gauge in another. The years after 1981 accumulated in clusters. Alina never ordered an entire yard because projected demand looked strong. She rebuilt a row when paid receipts covered the pad, shell, floor, fan, wiring, road work, handling equipment, labor, inspection, and reserve. If the reserve did not remain intact after the calculation, the row waited. Carl's brown ledger grew heavier. Its avoided purchase column became less useful as equivalent new bin designs changed, so he added separate columns for replacement cost, actual reconstruction cost, repair hours, and useful bushel years. He never allowed an old comparison to make a current decision. Steel that had been cheap in 1978 still required present-day inspection. Let me tell you about Aliner's standard pad, because the visible shell was only the last part placed. Survey stakes established a common reference elevation across each yard. Carl checked them with the polished brass plumb bob, his short, even steps carrying him from stake to stake, while Aliner recorded the readings. The finished ring had to remain level enough that wall sheets shared the vertical load and roof framing met without being forced. A low section beneath one side could allow settlement, pull a circular wall out of shape, and concentrate stress around bolt holes. Therefore, subgrade was stripped to suitable material, compacted in controlled lifts, and protected from standing water. Aliner specified pad elevation above surrounding drainage paths and refused to let a contractor hide soft soil beneath additional concrete. Aeration floors received the same discipline. Supports had to carry grain load without tipping, and perforated sections had to seat without openings wide enough to leak kernels into the plenum. Before filling, a worker entered each clean bin, checked floor alignment, cleared the fan transition, and verified that the sump and unloading path opened fully. A loose floor section discovered beneath grain was no longer a loose floor section. It was a buried repair. Fans followed service intervals based on hours and condition rather than the calendar alone. Bearings were listened to, belt tension checked, motor current compared with its earlier reading, guards secured, and housings examined for debris or corrosion. Temperature cables were tested before harvest by comparing points at a common ambient condition. An unreasonable reading on an empty August morning would not become more trustworthy beneath 7,000 bushels. Owner lot codes expanded with the network. The first digits identified county and yard. The next group identified year, commodity, and owner. A final suffix distinguished separate deliveries when moisture or grade made mixing undesirable even for the same customer. Scale tickets, sealed samples, fan logs, temperature sheets, and release orders all carried the same code. A smudged number was rewritten before the truck left the lane. Annual bolt checks were not performed by driving every fastener tighter. Aliner inspected seam condition, washer compression, corrosion, distortion around holes, and evidence of movement. Selected connections were checked to confirm the tightening method remained consistent, but unnecessary retightening could damage thin galvanized sheet or overcompress seals. The purpose was to find change, not manufacture the comforting sound of an impact wrench. By 1990, 260 rebuilt bins stood across 5 yards. Their combined usable capacity reached 1,933,000 bushels. The yards remained smaller than the largest terminal facilities, but their cells could hold oats beside soybeans, seed grain beside feed corn, and one owner's high-grade crop beside another owner's wetter delivery without turning every distinction into one average. Aliner was 41. Her copper-auburn hair still went into a practical braid before she stepped into the yards, though a few lighter strands caught against the green canvas collar. The cheap black notebook remained in her shirt pocket, repaired twice with clear tape along its back cover. Newer ledgers carried daily work, but the original notebook still held dimensions and decisions no copied form quite replaced. 1994. A writer named Martin Vale stopped at the Ashby yard after seeing 12 soybean grades listed across a cell board without commingling. He wrote for Practical Grain Review and had intended to spend 1 hour examining portable aeration equipment. He remained until dark. Martin watched Aliner trace one owner code from scale ticket to sample seal, bin assignment, temperature record, and release authorization. He asked why she had accepted the expense of 12 small cells instead of combining the soybeans into 2 larger tanks. Because they aren't the same grain, Aliner said. Some lots differed in moisture. Some differed in test weight, cleanliness, variety, intended market, or contract requirement. Combining them would reduce record work, but it could also erase the value preserved by the better lot and spread the management needs of the more difficult one. The shell saved expense only if the grain inside remained worth what the owner believed had entered. Martin's article described a network assembled from elevator demolition liabilities, but Aliner disliked the word salvage in his first draft. Salvage suggested that usefulness had ended and been partially recovered. The bins had always been engineered structures. Their location and ownership had failed, not their entire material function. Martin changed the sentence. The following winter, a regional grain handling association invited Alina to speak about modular thin-shell reuse and segregated storage. She accepted only after the organizer agreed to give her enough time to show actual cost and maintenance figures. She carried Carl's brown ledger to the meeting in a canvas case. At the lectern, Alina did not offer an inspirational account of bidding against silence. She opened the ledger and showed what the first 24-bin yard had cost, what it had earned, what had failed, what annual inspection consumed, and which expenses increased as the network spread across counties. She explained that thin galvanized sheets retained value only when load paths, hole condition, corrosion, geometry, foundations, fasteners, sealing, and airflow were treated as structural facts rather than thrift shop details. A questioner asked how quickly someone could reproduce the network. "How much paid-for material do you have?" Alina asked. The room became quiet enough to hear paper turn in Carl's ledger. "Let me tell you about the next 10 years because attention did not change Alina's pace. The article brought visitors and the meeting brought invitations, but neither poured a foundation. Receipts did. By 2000, 418 rebuilt bins operated across 9 yards with 3,089,000 bushels of usable capacity. Alina added yard managers only after they had worked through receiving, sampling, aeration, unloading, and record reconciliation. Nobody received authority over a cell board merely because they understood a spreadsheet. Grain did not become dry because a column said it should. The yards shared fan parts where performance allowed, portable augers where road distance made sharing practical, and one maintenance history for every numbered motor. However, each site retained the tools required to isolate a problem. A failed truck, torn belt, or flooded lane could inconvenience one yard without stopping the other 8. In 2010, the 566th rebuilt bin closed the last open gap in a 13-yard chain. Let me tell you why a network of small cells outlasted a single enormous site, because redundancy only matters when something stops. On an ordinary harvest day, duplicated roads, offices, fans, and receiving points can look inefficient. During a failure, those same separations become choices. June 27, 2012. A line of severe wind crossed Ashby County after sunset. At the western yard, the first gusts lifted gravel against the office windows. The second wave snapped utility poles along the county road, rolled an empty portable conveyor onto its side, and drove a detached sheet of roofing through the external receiving hopper enclosure. Power failed before the yard manager could complete shutdown checks. The bins remained standing. Alina's inspection program had rejected weakened wall sheets and maintained roof connections, but the external equipment had taken a direct beating. One auger tube bent near its support. The scale approach filled with branches and torn siding from a neighboring machine shed. Utility crews could not estimate when the line would return. At dawn, 7 loaded trucks were already moving toward that yard. Alina arrived in the faded green canvas jacket with a black notebook in her shirt pocket. At 63, she walked with the same measured heel-first steps, though she used the handrail when climbing from the office porch. She examined the receiving enclosure, checked each standing shell for distortion, and called the other 12 yards before answering any incoming driver. The redirection was not a simple search for empty space. One truck held soybeans under an identity-preserved contract. 2 carried corn above the moisture range of the nearest available fan. Another belonged to an owner whose earlier lot occupied a harrow cell with room remaining, but adding the new grain would have required a haul longer than the driver's fuel allowance could support. Road distance mattered, but condition came first. Alina matched each load by owner, grade, moisture, fan capacity, available depth, and release plan. 4 trucks went to separate Ashby County clusters. 2 were sent toward Dunlin. The identity-preserved soybeans traveled to Harrow, where an empty cleaned cell and documented conveyor cleanout were available. Every driver received a new destination and temporary route code before reaching the damaged yard. The original owner numbers did not change. Scale clerks attached redirection forms to the incoming tickets and recorded why each lot had moved. Sealed samples followed the grain, not the disabled receiving point. The damaged yard still held grain requiring aeration. 2 portable generators arrived that afternoon, but their combined output could not run every fan. Alina did not rotate power evenly merely to give each bin an equal turn. Temperature and moisture records established priority. A recently received wet corn cell received the first generator and continuous monitoring. A cooler dry corn cell could safely wait through the night. Soybeans with stable temperatures received shorter intervals. Fan motor starting current was considered before any connection, because a generator capable of carrying a running motor could still trip when that motor first started. Electricians established safe disconnects and grounding, while yard workers kept handwritten operating sheets beside each generator. By the second day, incoming grain was moving through other yards, selected fans were running, and every redirected lot remained traceable. The Western Ashby yard had lost normal receiving capacity, but the network had not lost its memory. Walter Kessler visited after the road reopened. He was 88, his sandy gray sideburns gone white, and the brass co-op counter key still rode in his pocket, though he had retired years before. His outward-turning gait had shortened, but he walked to the damaged conveyor and looked across the standing bins. One big tank would have stopped, he said. Aliner checked the temporary fan schedule. These didn't. Power returned on the fourth evening. Repairs to conveying equipment took 3 weeks, but no owner's lot was lost, mixed without authorization, or left without enough aeration to preserve condition. The failure remained local because the system had never required all useful capacity to pass through one point. Reconstruction continued. Let me tell you about the last 134 bins, because finishing the inventory required more judgment than starting it. The easiest shells had gone up first. Later bundles contained more marginal panels, incomplete hardware references, and roof sections whose original sequence demanded careful reconstruction. Aliner did not lower acceptance standards merely because the count approached 700. Sheets with cracked holes were rejected unless an engineered repair restored the connection without shifting load into unverified metal. Creased panels crossing major load paths left the inventory. Roof wedges with sound field areas but failed edges could sometimes provide repair stock, but they did not return to their former position by optimism. Each completed bin required a documented shell, not a ceremonial use of every piece. Replacement structural sections were purchased where original material could not safely serve. The count still followed the 700 original bin records because each reconstructed structure retained its tracked identity, dimensions, and service history, but no one pretended that every old bolt or damaged sheet deserved preservation. The bins were rebuilt to work. Harrow County gained additional clusters near farms whose harvest traffic no longer fit the old roads into Bellwether. Dunlin added yards beside all-weather routes. Ashby locations were chosen where three-phase power, drainage, and turning radius could be secured without pledging another site. Each deed, lease, and access agreement passed across the kitchen table before concrete moved. The 700th original bin entered service in 2019. Across 18 yards, the complete network provided 5,184,000 bushels of usable storage in Harrow, Dunlin, and Ashby counties. 11 failed elevator sites had been emptied by a deadline 39 years earlier. Their shells now stood closer to the farms that used them, separated into cells whose number had once seemed like the auction's greatest liability. For 2024, storage, aeration, handling, testing, coordinated receiving, and release services earned $2,462,400. Operating expense reached $1,571,936. The network retained $890,464 before taxes, reserves, capital replacement, and distributions. The operating expense was no longer the small list Carl had entered after the first harvest. Payroll across 18 yards took the largest share. Electricity and motor service followed. Insurance, property expense, testing, road maintenance, vehicles, augers, scales, temperature systems, safety work, accounting, snow removal, replacement steel, concrete repair, and reserve equipment filled the rest. Yet the original shells still did what Aliner had bought them to do. They enclosed separate grain under known conditions. Bellwether Co-op and 2 neighboring co-ops sent overflow according to written capacity notices. The largest storage network operating across the 3 counties had no single receiving tower, no central monument, and no site through which every bushel had to pass. Its size existed in the connection among 18 smaller places. March 2025. A woman named Ruth Voss called Aliner from the Dunlin yard and asked for 5 years of rejected load records. Ruth was 32, with a slim, athletic build, clear gray eyes behind matte black rectangular glasses, and freckles clustered over her right cheek. Her navy wax cotton jacket covered a white Oxford shirt, and a silver laptop stayed tucked beneath one arm as she walked the rows in long, quiet strides. Ruth had spent months comparing the loads Aliner's clerks redirected after arrival with the information farms already possessed before departure. Moisture estimates, commodity, owner, expected grade, truck location, intended storage duration, and harvest timing often existed separately. They reached the yard by telephone calls, handwritten notes, or memory, but they did not meet until a clerk faced the cell board. Ruth believed the decision could happen earlier. She requested the original black notebook. On April 9, 2025, Ruth Voss opened a silver laptop beside the original black notebook. The kitchen table bore shallow scratches from 57 years of cost sheets, lease drafts, fan curves, scale tickets, and coffee cups set down beside decisions. Carl's brown savings ledger rested near the center, its cloth spine faded almost gray. Aliner placed the black notebook to its left. Ruth set the laptop on its right and turned the screen so they could both read it. The date was the 47th anniversary of the auction. Ruth's proposal began with available cells. Each cell record carried yard, county, usable bushels, current occupancy, commodity restrictions, sanitation status, owner assignments, fan curve, measured operating pressure, temperature equipment, unloading method, road access, and estimated release date. The program would not treat nominal empty volume as capacity when airflow or planned duration made a deeper fill unsafe. Incoming grain would be described before the truck left the farm. The owner number came first. Commodity followed. Estimated bushels, moisture, grade information, road distance, truck weight limits, expected arrival time, and forecast storage duration narrowed the choices. If an existing separated lot belonging to the same owner could safely receive the grain without erasing a grade or moisture distinction, the program could suggest that cell. Otherwise, it selected among cleaned open cells with suitable fan capacity and handling access. Ruth moved one sample load across the screen. An Ashby County farmer had 680 bushels of corn at 21% moisture, a 38-mile maximum haul, and a planned storage period of 4 months. Several cells held enough empty volume, but 2 lacked sufficient airflow at the proposed grain depth. One was scheduled to release seed soybeans and had not completed cleanout. Another sat close enough, but its electrical service was already committed to 2 high-priority wet cells during the same receiving window. The program removed each unsuitable choice and displayed 3 possible destinations. The nearest safe cell appeared first, along with the reason it qualified. Aliner leaned toward the screen, her angular jaw resting briefly against one hand. At 76, her fair pink skin showed the years spent in Iowa wind, and her copper auburn braid had gone mostly silver without changing its practical shape. The thin wire-rimmed glasses, pale blue eyes, freckles across her narrow nose, and small crescent-shaped birthmark below her right ear remained familiar above the collar of the faded green canvas jacket. "What happens when the moisture estimate is wrong?" she asked. "The clerk tests the load and reassigns it if needed." "What happens to the first assignment?" "It stays in the record as rejected with the reason. What if the road closes after dispatch?" "The next safe cell is offered by travel time from the truck's current position." "What if 2 yards lose communication?" Ruth turned to a page showing locally stored cell tables. Each yard would hold its own current availability, printed at defined intervals. Telephone confirmation remained available. The software could suggest a destination, but the receiving clerk retained authority to reject any load whose measured condition, documentation, or physical appearance did not match the assignment. Ruth closed the sample route and folded her hands beside the keyboard. "It doesn't replace separation," she said. "It chooses the right paid-for cell sooner." That distinction held Aliner's attention. Routing could reduce unnecessary miles and prevent a wet load from arriving where an empty shell lacked enough fan. It could preserve owner and grade distinctions before a truck joined a receiving line. However, software could not make 2 lots physically separate after they entered the same bin. It could not increase airflow, clean a conveyor, repair a temperature cable, or identify a sour odor inside grain if the person opening the hatch ignored it. The cells still had to do the work. Let me tell you about Aliner's answer, because she had once waited 3 days while Carl studied $8,750, 9 permitted acres, a removal deadline, and a plan nobody else could see. She now controlled 18 yards, 700 bins, and 5,184,000 bushels of capacity. She could have asked for a committee, a trial report, or a season of discussion. She read the one-page operating limits Ruth had printed. "Yes," Alina said. "Keep handwritten scale tickets when the electronics fail." Ruth nodded once. "I will." Permission took less than a minute. Alina opened a kitchen drawer and removed the leather belt pouch Carl had carried through the first foundations. The polished brass plumb bob lay inside, its point protected by a folded square of cloth. Carl had used it to check the original 24-bin yard, then placed it in Alina's hand when he granted her 9 acres under one condition. It had crossed every later yard, hanging against survey stakes while concrete forms were corrected by fractions no customer would ever see. Alina set it beside Ruth's laptop. Ruth touched the brass but did not lift it immediately. For the routing project, for whatever needs checking. Ruth picked up the plumb bob by its cord. The brass swung once above the scratch table and settled into a straight line. "Count what remains, not what is missing," Alina said. The words had begun with Carl's way of reading a poor year. They had counted sound sheets after damaged ones were rejected, cash after lower receipts, useful hours after failed tests, and owned capacity after interest stripped newer equipment from neighboring farms. Now Ruth looked at a network whose information moved more slowly than its trucks and counted the records already available. She did not propose replacing the yellow tags, sealed samples, handwritten tickets, fan sheets, or human inspection. She connected them sooner. During the following week, Ruth worked from the Harrow office. Her silver laptop remained open beside copies of county cell boards while she translated Alina's operating rules into choices the program could explain. A destination could not appear merely because it was mathematically efficient. The screen had to state why the cell matched and what condition would cancel the assignment. If measured moisture exceeded the planned range, the clerk saw the required action. If fan capacity became unavailable, the cell closed to new loads. If a road added too much time, routing shifted without changing the owner code. If a temperature record triggered priority aeration, the program reduced electrical capacity available for incoming wet grain at that yard. Alina required printed exception reports. Ruth wanted them too. A program that always appeared correct would conceal the exact situations capable of improving it. Rejected recommendations showed where field conditions differed from assumptions. Their first live test involved 14 farms, 3 yards, and 41 scheduled loads. 37 reached the suggested cell without reassignment. 2 arrived wetter than estimated and moved to stronger fans. 1 truck changed yards after a county bridge closed. Another load remained on the farm because no safe cell existed within its permitted distance and fan requirement. Ruth did not call that final result a failure. A false destination would have been the failure. At the end of the test, Alina compared every digital assignment with the handwritten scale ticket, sample number, cell entry, and fan record. The owner codes matched. The rejected recommendations remained visible. No grain had been mixed to make the schedule look clean. Walter Kessler came to the Harrow yard that May. At 99, he no longer walked the rows, so Ruth brought the laptop to the office window overlooking the original cluster. Walter wore gold-rimmed aviator glasses and a rust-red quilted vest that had been let out at the sides. The old brass co-op key rested in his palm. Ruth showed him how bellwether overflow could be assigned before a truck left the co-op scale. Walter studied the available cells, then looked through the window at the first 24 roofs. "At the auction," he said, "I thought the land was worth more once those were gone." Alina stood beside the black notebook. The lender thought so too. Walter gave the quiet breath of a laugh, but there was no certainty in it now. He had spent decades sending grain toward roofs he once believed had nowhere useful to stand. His first referral sheet, yellowed and framed near the office door, had become one of the records Ruth used to define the new routing fields. He handed Ruth the brass counter key. "The old scale desk is locked," he said. "This still opens it." Ruth added the key to the table but did not remove the plumb bob from her jacket pocket. April 9th returned the following year with trucks moving among 18 yards according to condition rather than habit. At the kitchen table, Carl's brown ledger lay closed beneath the black notebook. Ruth's laptop displayed open capacity by county. The brass plumb bob rested across its charging cord. The original auction inventory remained legible on the notebook's first worn pages. 700 galvanized grain bins as situated, removal required by September 30th, 1980. Every record ended with removed. Every bin stood again. She bought the shells. She kept the lots separate. The hard year came. The debt did not. She rebuilt one row, then another. The wind stopped 1 yard. 17 kept working. 700 roofs with nowhere to put them, 18 yards knew otherwise.